In this section, we'll examine blood flow, the sounds that the heart makes, and the cardiac cycle as a whole. The cardiac cycle is one complete contraction and relaxation of all four chambers of the heart. Atrial systole, or contraction, occurs while the ventricles are in diastole, and atrial diastole occurs while the ventricles are in systole. And this is very important in order to get blood to circulate through the heart in the way that it needs to. There's a quiescent period where all four chambers are relaxed at the same time. First, let's examine some of the principles of pressure and flow. It's pretty straightforward stuff, but there are two main variables that will govern whether fluid moves. First of all, pressure. Does it have enough pressure difference between 2 points to force it in a particular direction? And then resistance, which is the opposition to the fluid flow. So we measure pressure in millimeters of mercury with a manometer or a sphygmomanometer. The great vessels have a positive blood pressure, so the ventricular pressure has to rise above the pressure of the vessel in order to create a pressure differential and thus have blood flow into the great vessels. So the fluid is going to flow only if it's subjected to more pressure at one point than another. This creates the pressure gradient, and fluid will flow down its pressure gradient from high pressure to low pressure. Let's look at the left side of the heart as an example. When the ventricle relaxes and expands, its internal pressure falls. It's a negative pressure. And if the bicuspid valve is open, then blood is going to flow into the left ventricle. It's almost sucked into the left ventricle. However, when the ventricle contracts, the internal pressure rises. This causes the AV valve to close, and it forces open the aortic valve, and blood flows into the aorta from the left ventricle. The opening and closing of all the valves are governed by these pressure changes. The AV valves are limp when the ventricles are relaxed, and the semilunar valves are under pressure from blood vessels when the ventricles are relaxed. So backflow in towards the heart because the vessels themselves have pressure, and the ventricles being relaxed have a negative pressure. So without the valve, the blood would backflow into the heart. Let's look at that through this picture. Here, when atria contracts, it's squeezing blood into the ventricle. Shortly after that, the ventricle expands as the heart relaxes, and it sucks blood into the ventricle. As the ventricle contracts again, it squishes blood up through the semilunar valves and out into the system. Here you can see the idea of backflow from the major vessels. The blood is pushing back against these semilunar valves. This pressure keeps the valves closed and prevents backflow of blood into the heart. Valvular insufficiency or incompetence results when a valve prevents the reflux or regurgitation of backflow of blood into the heart. Valvular stenosis is a condition where the cusps are stiffened and the opening is constricted by scar tissue. Sometimes this is a result of rheumatic fever, which is an autoimmune attack on the mitral and aortic valves. What happens is the heart then overworks and becomes enlarged. The attack on these valves causes scarring, which leads them to become constricted. The heart is overworked, and so it becomes enlarged. And also, we'll probably hear a heart murmur, which is an abnormal heart sound produced by the regurgitation of blood through these incompetent valves. In mitral valve prolapse, we see an insufficiency in one or both mitral valve cusps. They bulge into the atria during ventricular contraction. This is a hereditary condition in about 1 in 40 people. In some people it causes chest pain and shortness of breath. The good news now is that we have means to replace these valves. So auscultation is the practice of listening to sounds that are made by the body. And as we're all familiar, the heart definitely makes sounds. The first of the sounds we hear is the louder and longer lub. It occurs with closure of the AV valves and results from turbulence in the bloodstream and movements of the heart wall. The second sound we hear is softer and sharper. We call it the dup. It occurs at the closure of the semilunar valves because of turbulence again and movements of the heart wall. There's a third sound that's rarely heard in people over 30. That's S3. The exact cause of that sound is not quite known. Now, when we go into the cardiac cycle, it's going to be broken into 4 phases: ventricular filling, isovolumetric contraction, ventricular ejection, and then isovolumetric relaxation. All of these events are completed in less than 1 second. The figure on the left will be a great guide for you learning the major events of this cardiac cycle. Let's begin by looking at ventricular filling. During diastole, the ventricles will expand, which causes a pressure drop below that of the atria. As the AV valve opens, the blood flows into the ventricles. Ventricular filling occurs in 3 different phases. The first third is where the blood enters very quickly. It's called rapid ventricular filling. And then diastasis is the second 1/3, which is marked by much slower filling. And this is where the P wave occurs. And then atrial systole, which is the final 1/3, where the atria actually contract. So most of the blood is actually sucked into the ventricle by its expansion. The last 1/3 is squeezed in by the atrial contraction. The end diastolic volume is the amount of blood that's contained in each ventricle at the end of ventricular filling. Usually that's about 130 milliliters of blood. In the phase of isovolumetric contraction, we'll see the atria repolarize and relax. They'll remain in diastole for the rest of the cardiac cycle. The ventricles, however, are going to depolarize and create the QRS complex as they begin to contract. This causes the AV valve to close as the ventricular blood gets pushed back against the cusps. This is where we hear the heart sound S1. We call this phase isovolumetric because even though the ventricles contract, they're not contracting at a high enough pressure to override the resistance in the great vessels. The pressure in the aorta is about 80 millimeters of mercury, and in the pulmonary trunk it's about 10 millimeters of mercury, but it's not quite that high yet in the ventricles. The cardiocytes are exerting a force, but with all 4 valves closed, so blood can't go anywhere yet. That's where we come into the next phase of ventricular ejection. During ventricular ejection, the blood pressure in the ventricle begins to exceed the arterial pressure and forces the semilunar valves open. The pressure peaks in the left ventricle about 120 millimeters of mercury and only about 25 millimeters of mercury in the right. And that's again because the pulmonary circuit is much smaller than the systemic circuit that's supplied by the left ventricle, as well as the fact that we don't want the blood pressure in the lungs to be too high. I'll explain the reason for this in a future chapter. So blood's going to spurt out of each ventricle rapidly at first in the process of rapid ejection, and then reduced ejection under less pressure at the end of the squishing. The ventricular ejection lasts about 200 to 250 milliseconds. This corresponds precisely with the plateau phase of the cardiac action potential. The T wave occurs late in the ventricular ejection phase. The stroke volume is about 70 milliliters of blood. That is the fraction of blood that's ejected of the 130 milliliters in each ventricle. That leads us to an ejection fraction of 54%. We might see that go up as high as 90% in the case of vigorous exercise. The end systolic volume is whatever blood is left behind, in this example 60 milliliters. Our final phase is isovolumetric relaxation. This occurs during early ventricular diastole, during the relaxation phase of the ventricles, when the T wave ends and the ventricles begin to expand. It's the elastic recoil and expansion that happens in this phase that causes the pressure to drop rapidly, that will allow blood to be sucked into the ventricles. Blood from the aorta and pulmonary arteries briefly flows backwards. This fills the semilunar valves and closes the cusps, preventing backflow into the heart. It creates a slight pressure rebound, which appears as the diacritic notch, which is seen in the aortic pressure curve right here. This is where we hear the heart sound S2 as blood rebounds from the closed semilunar valves and the ventricles expand. We call this phase isovolumetric because the semilunar valves are closed and the AV valves have not yet opened. The ventricles are therefore not actually taking in any blood yet. When the AV valves open, the phase of ventricular filling begins again. The negative pressure in the ventricles will suck the blood out of the atria and into the ventricles. Now let's take a quick look at all of these volume changes. We introduced some big terminology. End systolic volume, or ESV, is usually about 60 milliliters. Passively added volume to the ventricle during atrial diastole, or atrial relaxation, is about 30 milliliters. Added by atrial systole, the contraction of the ventricles, is about 40 milliliters, which gives us a total end diastolic volume of 130 milliliters. The stroke volume is how much we eject during ventricular systole, or ventricular contraction, will be 70 milliliters during rest usually, and that will leave an end systolic volume again of 60 milliliters. It's very important that both ventricles eject the same amount of blood. Otherwise, we'll see some of the effects of what is congestive heart failure. It results from the failure of either ventricle to eject blood effectively. This usually occurs to a heart that's been weakened by a heart attack, or chronic hypertension, or valvular insufficiency, or sometimes from congenital defects in the heart structure. Left ventricular failure will cause blood to back up into the lungs. The additional blood pressure in the lungs will cause pulmonary edema, that is, fluid moving into the lungs. It results in shortness of breath and a sense of suffocation because gases are not able to exchange across those membranes as easily as they should. When we see right ventricular failure, we'll see that the blood backs up into the vena cava, causing systemic or generalized edema because blood is now trapped in the system. This results in enlargement of the liver, ascites, where we see the pooling of fluid in the abdominal cavity, distension of the jugular veins, swelling of the fingers and ankles and feet, which is a sign of edema. Fluid is having to remain in the tissues. This eventually leads to total heart failure as the fluid balances in each of the circuits becomes more and more imbalanced. So now would be a great time to dig into this figure and see if you can piece together all the events of the cardiac cycle. You can almost use this figure as a base for your diagram. I know, it's a lot of stuff to sort out. By investigating the top pressure trace here, you can start to understand what causes the valves to open and close. By looking at the ventricular volumes, you can begin to understand the terminology of end diastolic volume and systolic volume. By checking out the ECG trace, we can see which phases of the cardiac cycle are governed. We can see which phases of the ECG trace are governed by which stages of the cardiac cycle. And also we can correlate the heart sounds. It's important for you to spend some time with this, so go ahead and do that now before we move on to our final section of this chapter.